It was a Thursday morning in Boston, late spring, but the air still held a crisp edge, the kind that hinted summer was near but hadn't quite arrived. The city was already awake, horns echoing off brownstones, coffee carts filling sidewalks with steam, and the hum of movement rising like a slow crescendo. But on a street lined with sleek, modern architecture and polished storefronts, there stood a building that gleamed just a little brighter than the rest. Newport Prestige Motors. Inside, everything was curated to impress. Imported marble flooring reflected rows of hypercars, Bugattis, McLarens, Ferraris, and one impossibly rare Pagani Huayra Roadster displayed like a sculpture under spotlight. The smell in the air was part espresso, part Italian leather, and part wealth. It wasn't just a car dealership, it was a temple of status. At precisely 10:04 a.m., the silence of the automatic glass doors parted, and a new presence stepped inside. She didn't arrive in a chauffeur-driven car, didn't wear designer shoes, didn't carry herself like someone who had ever been catered to by rooms like this. She was 16, dressed in a slightly oversized school uniform, her sneakers worn smooth at the toes, her backpack a little too heavy for her frame. Her curls were pulled into a puff, a few tendrils slipping out onto her forehead, and her eyes, wide, thoughtful, and serious, took in the room with a quiet reverence. Her name was Amani Brooks. She didn't walk like someone looking to be seen. She didn't hold a phone out to film the space. In fact, she kept her hands in her jacket pockets, shoulders slightly hunched, as though trying to stay small, but her gaze was clear and steady. She wasn't just wandering, she wasn't just curious. She was there for one reason: to see the Pagani. Her mother had once told her stories about that car, its aerodynamics, its craftsmanship, how it wasn't built for showing off, but for those who respected engineering as an art form. Her mother, a brilliant mechanical engineer, had passed away 3 years ago. Since then, cars had become more than a hobby to Imani. They were memories, a way back to her. The Pagani was a dream they used to whisper about together. She approached slowly, each step soft against the echoing floor. She didn't dare breathe too loudly. And when she reached the base of the platform where the car sat, she stopped and simply admired it. She noticed the curvature of the side panel, the titanium exhaust, the intricacy of the stitching inside the seats. Her mouth curved slightly into a smile, small but real. "Can I help you?" The voice came sharply, not with curiosity, but with control. Amani turned. A man in his mid-30s stood a few feet away, arms crossed, a smile too practiced to be warm. His suit was tailored, his watch expensive, and the name tag on his chest read, Ethan Voss, sales manager. "I'm just looking," she replied. He nodded, but not kindly. "This is Newport Prestige. These aren't the kind of cars you just look at, especially without an appointment. Do you have someone with you?" Amani blinked. "No. I just wanted to see, you understand that this car," he gestured toward the Pagani with an exaggerated motion, as if she hadn't already spent 10 minutes quietly admiring it, "is worth more than most homes in this city?" She nodded. "Yes, I know." Something in her voice, a certainty, a calmness, seemed to bother him more than her presence. Ethan's smile tightened. "Look, young lady, this isn't a museum. These cars are for serious buyers. We have a policy about loitering." There was no policy, but the tone, the message, was unmistakable. "You don't belong here." Amani looked down at her shoes, not because she felt ashamed, but because she was trying to hold herself still. The last thing she wanted was to cry. Not here. Not in front of a man who thought her value could be measured by her shoes. Behind Ethan, a junior salesman chuckled under his breath. Another leaned in to whisper something to a colleague. A couple browsing a Ferrari turned to glance at her. curiosity laced with quiet judgment. Imani took a breath. It caught halfway in her chest. She looked up once more at the Pagani, its gleaming surface reflecting back her own image, small and out of place. Then she turned around. "Sorry to disturb you," she said, voice calm, controlled. She walked toward the door, each step measured. The air in the room felt heavier than when she'd arrived. As she reached the exit, the automatic doors parted again. The moment she stepped outside, the noise of the city hit her like a wave. She didn't stop. Not on the sidewalk, not at the train station, not even when she finally found a seat on the subway headed back toward her neighborhood. She kept her eyes forward, her back straight. But inside, something was breaking. Not in the way that leaves someone shattered. No, this was different. This was a fracture with clarity. A crack that let something new come in. She didn't cry. Not once. Instead, she opened the side pocket of her backpack, pulled out her journal, and began to write. Thursday, 10:32 a.m., Newport Prestige Motors. I walked into a world built for people who wear power like a second skin. I was asked to leave, not for what I did, but for who they thought I couldn't be. But I know who I am, and I know who my mother was. And I promise myself this: I will walk back into rooms like that, not to prove a point, but to make space for someone else to feel seen. When she got home later that day, she didn't mention it to her father. He was on a Zoom call in his study, something about an energy grant for low-income neighborhoods. His voice carried its usual rhythm, measured, intelligent, full of care. Dr. Isaiah Brooks was known in many circles, but to Imani, he was just Dad. She didn't want to upset him, not yet. She had always admired his ability to stay calm, even in the face of ignorance. He had taught her that dignity wasn't about silence. It was about timing, and knowing when your presence was louder than anyone's insult. So instead, she sat at the kitchen table, pulled out her physics homework, and turned her attention to momentum equations. She found comfort in the math, in the fact that forces, when applied properly, always created movement. That night, as the lights dimmed in their brownstone home, Isaiah knocked softly on her bedroom door. "You all right, baby girl?" he asked. Imani looked up from her notebook. "Yeah, just tired." He paused, watched her for a moment. "You're carrying something," he said. She smiled. "A dream." He smiled back, not needing to know more. "Well, just don't carry it alone." After he left, Imani lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Her mind went back to the Pagani. She imagined herself behind the wheel, the engine purring beneath her hands, her mother's voice in the passenger seat saying, "Look at you." But this time, the dealership wasn't in the background. It wasn't even part of the picture. This dream didn't belong to Newport Prestige. It belonged to her, and soon the world would know it. Because some people are made to break barriers. Others, they are made to rebuild the room entirely. And Imani Brooks had never been the kind to wait for permission to enter. Morning unfolded like any other at Newport Prestige Motors. The glass showroom windows shimmered under the early Boston light, refracting the gold of a rising sun onto the hoods of machines engineered for power and prestige. Everything about the place, its marble floors, minimalist layout, and the velvet rope platforms that held cars worth more than entire apartment buildings, spoke of perfection. It was a place meticulously curated to separate not just vehicles, but people, those who belonged, and those who didn't. Ethan Voss moved through the space with his usual confidence. He wore his power well, tailored suit, polished loafers, and an expensive scent that lingered just a second longer than necessary. He had spent years cultivating this environment, this identity. To him, success looked like exclusivity. Clients with black cards, last names that opened doors, shoes that didn't scuff floors. He had already pushed yesterday's interruption, the girl, the awkwardness, out of his mind. She had been an inconvenience, nothing more, a moment to manage, and he had. The world, in Ethan's view, moved on quickly for people like him. At 10:17 a.m., the street outside quieted, not audibly, not in any way you could measure, but there was a subtle shift, the kind of silence that only announces itself in contrast to the noise that preceded it. One of the receptionists glanced up, instinctively sensing something was off, and then the car appeared. A Rolls-Royce Spectre, obsidian black, its paint so deeply reflective it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, pulled into the front lot. It moved with the kind of grace that turned heads before people even understood why they were turning. The engine stopped. The doors remained closed for a few seconds longer than anyone expected, long enough to make the silence in the showroom feel heavy, long enough to let discomfort bloom. Then the back door opened. The man who stepped out didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. Dr. Isaiah Brooks commanded attention with the kind of presence that money alone could never buy. It was in the deliberate way he stood, the calmness in his shoulders, the way his gaze passed through the glass as though it had already calculated every variable inside. He was dressed in a charcoal suit, crisp and unassuming, paired with a muted blue tie. No flash, no accessories. Yet the very air around him shifted. Ethan caught sight of him through the window and smiled reflexively, already moving toward the entrance. Someone who stepped out of a car like that was a client worth chasing. The doors opened. "Welcome to Newport Prestige Motors," Ethan said, offering a practiced smile. "I'm Ethan Voss, sales manager here. It's a pleasure to have you with us today." Dr. Brooks regarded him in silence for a long moment. His eyes, sharp and discerning, swept the showroom before settling on Ethan with quiet precision. "I'm not here to shop," he said. Ethan hesitated. The smile remained, but thinner now. "Oh, I see. Are you here on behalf of a client?" "No," Isaiah said. "I'm here about an incident." Ethan blinked, then nodded, attempting to maintain composure. "I'm sorry?" "Yesterday, Dr. Brooks continued, a young girl walked into your dealership, alone, modestly dressed. She was looking at one of your most valuable vehicles, and she was treated not as a customer, but as an inconvenience. The space between them filled with a sudden stillness. A few staff nearby slowed their movements, ears straining subtly toward the exchange. Dr. Brooks continued, voice even, unhurried. She was spoken to with condescension, humiliated publicly. No one intervened. No one asked who she was, or why she was there, or what she might carry inside her, not in her wallet, but in her mind, in her story, in her right to simply be curious without being criminalized. Ethan shifted slightly, his stance faltering for the first time. "I wasn't made aware of any—" "That young woman," Isaiah said, stepping forward now, his voice still calm, "is my daughter." The words landed like a thunderclap. Ethan's breath caught for a moment. Dr. Brooks didn't stop. "Her name is Imani Brooks. She is 16. She's smarter than half the engineers I've worked with in my life. And she walked into this space not to test your patience, but to honor the memory of her mother, a woman who once taught her that beauty can be found in engineering, that art can live in machinery, that ambition should never be limited by the cut of your clothes or the color of your skin." Ethan tried to speak, but no words came. His mind raced, but his body remained still, frozen by the sudden realization of just how badly he had misread the previous day. "I did not come here to create a scene," Isaiah said, his tone dropping into something even more controlled. "And I'm not here to shout. What I came to do is witness, to make sure the people responsible for her pain understand the weight of it, because you saw a young black girl in sneakers and a uniform and decided she didn't belong. But I assure you, He stepped close enough for Ethan to see his own reflection in Dr. Brooks's eyes. She belongs in any room she chooses to enter. There was a silence that followed, longer than the last, and infinitely heavier. Ethan's expression had shifted entirely. The arrogance that had once held his posture upright had drained from his body. Around them, no one moved. Even the cars seemed to wait. Isaiah turned to glance around the showroom once more. It's not about who you let in, Mr. Voss. It's about who you try to keep out. Then, without another word, he walked past him, each step unhurried, steady. By the time he reached the door, Ethan still hadn't moved. The Rolls-Royce's door opened again, seemingly on cue. Dr. Brooks entered. The car, like its occupant, didn't roar when it left. It glided away, smooth and measured, leaving behind the hollow echo of power that didn't need to announce itself. Inside the showroom, someone finally exhaled. Ethan remained rooted in place. He could feel the stares now, the sudden shift in how he was being perceived, the cold eyes of his colleagues who had laughed with him yesterday but now refused to meet his gaze. He returned to his office in silence. For the first time in a long time, the polished marble beneath his feet didn't feel like a stage. It felt like judgment. The next day, the calls began. A video, one Ethan didn't know had been taken, surfaced online. A grainy but clear clip of Imani standing at the center of the showroom while his voice, sharp and dismissive, echoed around her. The comments were swift, scathing. She didn't even raise her voice. Grace under fire. Shame on them. Another example of why our daughters need armor. The dealership's social media was flooded. Phone calls came in. Local news outlets requested interviews. Activists, parents, students, all outraged by the coldness of the encounter. But Dr. Brooks remained silent. He issued no statement, filed no complaint. Ethan didn't understand it. He had expected wrath, retaliation, at the very least, legal action. But there was only silence. And that silence grew louder with each passing hour, until, days later, a letter arrived at the dealership, addressed to Richard Mason, the owner. It was brief. It didn't demand. It offered an invitation, a chance, and with it, a challenge that would change Ethan's life forever. But he didn't know that yet. For now, all he had was the memory of a girl he had dismissed, a man whose presence had shattered his illusion of control, and a voice that echoed louder in his absence than it ever could have in confrontation. Imani Brooks had left the showroom without raising her voice, but somehow she had said everything that needed to be heard. His world moved fast when it wanted to punish someone. In the digital age, condemnation had a rhythm of its own, swift, scorching, and often unforgiving. But what made this different wasn't just the outrage. It was the silence from the one person who had every right to make noise. Dr. Isaiah Brooks hadn't spoken a word publicly since his visit to Newport Prestige Motors. He hadn't posted online, hadn't given a single interview. He didn't need to. The internet had done the talking for him. Within 48 hours of Imani's quiet ejection from the dealership and her father's quiet reckoning the next day, the video, taken by an observant customer and posted anonymously, began to circle like wildfire. At first, it lived in corners of Twitter, then on TikTok, then spread through Reddit threads with captions like, "Another day, another reminder why black girls need to fight for the space they deserve." The footage wasn't dramatic. There was no shouting, no confrontation. But it was the restraint, the painful politeness, and the weight of what wasn't said that made it so gutting. You could hear the shift in the room when Imani spoke. You could hear the patronizing tone in Ethan's voice. You could see the way she held her dignity like a fragile glass in a room full of hammers. Viewers didn't need a backstory. They understood what it was the moment they saw it, and they knew, intuitively, collectively, that something wrong had been done. Within 3 days, Newport Prestige Motors was bombarded. Google reviews turned from glowing five-star testimonials to long paragraphs of disgust. People who had never stepped foot in Boston left comments calling for a boycott. The dealership's Instagram page became a battleground of accountability. And while the marketing team tried to delete comments and moderate the chaos, the narrative had already slipped beyond their control. Inside the glass fortress, the tension grew thick and bitter. Ethan Voss, once untouchable, found himself the subject of staff whispers and side glances. Even those who had laughed along with him during Amani's visit now distanced themselves. The confidence he wore like a tailored suit had begun to fray at the seams. He didn't sleep much those first few nights. At first, he told himself it would blow over. Then, when it didn't, he tried to justify. She didn't look like someone who belonged there, he thought. It wasn't about race. It was about presentation, professionalism. But those defenses crumbled the more he heard the clip played back. His voice, once proud, now sounded bitter and hollow. The tone, stripped of context, revealed everything. On the morning of the fifth day, Richard Mason, the dealership owner, summoned Ethan to his office. The blinds were drawn, and the lights dimmed to avoid the glare of another news van parked across the street. "She's not speaking to the press," Richard said, pacing. "That's what's killing us." Ethan sat stiffly, unsure what to say. If she went public, we could deal with it, apologize, issue a statement, call it a misunderstanding. But the silence, it makes it worse. Like we're beneath her energy. "She hasn't responded to anything?" Ethan asked. "No." Richard stopped. "But her father has." He opened a drawer and slid a letter across the desk. Heavy paper, embossed letterhead, handwritten signature. Ethan leaned in and began to read. "Dear Mr. Bashi Mason, I've considered the many ways I could respond to what occurred in your showroom. Legal action, media campaigns, financial retribution. But none of those would teach what needs to be learned. I don't believe in empty apologies. I believe in correction. And sometimes the only path to that is through humility. I'm offering you an alternative. Enclose your senior staff, Mr. Voss included, in a one-week empathy immersion program at the Brooks Community Center. You will not attend as observers, but as participants. You will serve, listen, and learn. Not because I demand it, but because you need it. This is not revenge. This is education. You may decline, of course, but understand, your choice will speak louder than anything your PR team could ever craft. Sincerely, Dr. Isaiah Brooks." Ethan read it twice, then once more. His fingers trembled slightly as he placed it back on the desk. Richard spoke after a beat of silence. "You're going." Ethan started to protest, but Richard cut him off. "You're going, Ethan, or you can clear out your office today." For the first time in his professional life, Ethan had no retort, no counteroffer. He nodded, silent. 3 days later, Ethan arrived at the Brooks Community Center with two of his colleagues, Amir, the finance manager, and Justine, a top-performing salesperson. All three were dressed too formally, too stiffly for a place that hummed with casual energy and grounded purpose. The center sat in the heart of Roxbury, one of Boston's oldest and most richly historic black neighborhoods. A neighborhood Ethan had only ever driven through with the windows up. Inside, they were greeted by a woman named Linda. No formal title, no pretense, just a warm presence and steady eyes that made Ethan instantly uncomfortable, not because she was rude, but because she looked at him like she already knew who he was behind the suit. "Here," she said, handing each of them a name badge, a clipboard, and an apron. "You'll start in the kitchen." That first morning, Ethan chopped vegetables beside a 15-year-old volunteer who told him, matter-of-factly, about the housing crisis in Boston. That afternoon, he played math games with 8-year-olds who solved equations faster than he could. And by the evening, he was helping mop the hallway floors under the guidance of a maintenance worker named Howard, who used to be an electrical engineer in Haiti before moving to the States. No one knew who he was. No one cared. And for the first time, he felt it, the absence of hierarchy, the dissolving of status. By the second day, he met Jaden, 10 years old, wiry, bright-eyed, and full of unfiltered enthusiasm. He sat cross-legged in the corner of a reading room, dismantling an old remote control car with surgical focus. "What are you building?" Ethan asked. Jaden glanced up. "I'm not building. I'm trying to see why it stopped working. You can't fix what you don't understand." Ethan nodded slowly. "That's smart." Jaden shrugged. "Imani says that." The name hit Ethan like a slow punch to the gut. "You know Imani?" "She's the best," Jaden grinned. "She helps me with science. We're gonna build a solar-powered go-kart this summer." Ethan said nothing, just watched as the boy continued to work, each turn of the screwdriver impossibly precise for hands so small. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling in the small guest room the center had provided, his chest heavy with something unfamiliar. Not guilt. Guilt was reactive, performative. This was deeper. It was the first crack in a long dormant foundation. On the third day, he cried. He was sitting alone after lunch, watching a group of children practice a spoken word piece about being underestimated. Their voices were soft at first, then grew stronger, rising together like waves against stone. One line, spoken by a girl no older than 12, pierced straight through him. "They tried to measure me in silence, but I speak louder when I don't need to yell." It was Imani, all over again. He left the room, found an empty hallway, sank to the floor, and cried. He didn't know how long he stayed there, but when he stood up, something in him had shifted. That evening, back in his room, he pulled out a piece of paper from the back of his notebook. Not a screen, not a press release, just his own handwriting. "Imani, I don't know if this will reach you, but I need to try. I said things I can't take back. I made you feel small when I should have made you feel seen. You carried grace, I carried prejudice. And you were stronger than I had the decency to understand. I'm sorry. Not for how I looked, but for how I refused to see. You were never out of place. I was. I hope one day you'll see that I've changed. Not in words, but in who I'm becoming." Ethan. He folded the letter, left it with Linda, didn't ask for confirmation, didn't expect redemption. But maybe, just maybe, he had taken the first step toward it. Changed. By the fourth day at the Brooks Community Center, Ethan Voss no longer wore his tailored suit. The starch had come out of his shirt collars. His steps no longer echoed with the confidence of someone who believed the world owed him its attention. He had stopped checking his watch every 15 minutes, stopped pulling out his phone under the table to check emails that no longer mattered the way they once did. Something had begun to break open inside him, not like a shatter, but like a slow unfurling. And with that quiet unfolding came an unfamiliar emotion, presence. It wasn't something Ethan could name yet, but he felt it the same way one might feel the first breath of air after surfacing from deep underwater. The kind of clarity that doesn't come from trying harder, but from finally letting go of the narratives you were raised to believe. He had stopped pretending to be in control of the environment. The community center didn't bend to him. It didn't make room for ego or performance. It simply went on, with or without his participation. That in itself was a lesson. Mornings began early. He helped serve breakfast to children who greeted him with sleepy eyes and eager smiles. They weren't impressed by his name, his background, or his former status. They cared that the oatmeal was warm, the juice was cold, and that someone asked how they slept. At first, Ethan found the routine exhausting, but over time, it became grounding, predictable in the best way. There was a rhythm to the center, a pulse. It beat in the clatter of dishes in the kitchen, in the rustle of backpacks being unzipped, in the overlapping voices of kids reciting poems, telling stories, asking questions that grown men had long stopped asking. It beat loudest in Jaden. The boy had become a constant shadow, trailing Ethan with casual comfort. He showed up with new science questions every day, carrying a tattered notebook where he wrote down ideas that spilled faster than he could contain. He had drawn a full blueprint for the solar-powered go-kart he hoped to build with Imani this summer, complete with labeled wires and gear ratios. Ethan was in awe. Jaden asked Ethan questions too. Some were light-hearted. What's your favorite animal? Have you ever seen a whale? But others weren't. One morning, as they sorted donated school supplies, Jaden asked, "Did you always like kids, or did someone make you come here?" Ethan froze, a pen still in his hand. Jaden looked up, blinking. "It's okay. I just want to know. You looked mad when you first got here." Ethan set the pen down. He hadn't prepared for this kind of honesty. Not from someone who barely reached his shoulder, who still wore Spider-Man sneakers with frayed Velcro straps. "I didn't want to be here at first," he admitted. Jaden nodded, unsurprised. "I could tell. But I'm glad I am now," Ethan added, more quietly. Jaden grinned. "Good. I think it makes you better." That night, Ethan sat alone in the reading room long after the kids had gone home. The quiet felt different than the silence of the showroom. This one wasn't sterile or cold. It was full of what had been said during the day, what had been felt, what had gone unsaid but still managed to echo. He wandered through the building, pausing at the corkboard in the main hallway. There were photos pinned to it, smiling kids, volunteers, visiting speakers. In the center, laminated and trimmed with gold tape, was a quote: "We don't rise by lifting ourselves. We rise by lifting others." It was signed simply, Imani Brooks. Her name wasn't large or spotlighted. It was simply there. But the weight it carried inside that building was unmistakable. Ethan realized something in that moment. She had already changed lives here. Long before she walked into his dealership, long before the world knew her name through a viral video. She had been doing the quiet work. The work he had dismissed. The kind of work that doesn't make headlines but makes futures. He had spent years believing power came from wealth, from exclusivity, from commanding attention. But here, power came from connection, from listening without responding, from showing up when no one was watching. Later that week, Ethan joined Linda and the other volunteers for a group discussion. It wasn't formal, just chairs in a circle, coffee in mismatched mugs, and tired people who had chosen compassion over comfort. The topic was understanding proximity, how distance, physical, emotional, systemic, allowed people to make decisions without ever confronting their consequences. A teacher named Carmen spoke about a student who had been evicted twice in one school year and how that child's attention in class was labeled as defiance instead of survival. A nurse shared stories about children who came in with empty stomachs and bruises they were too proud to explain. Every person there had stories, and every story carved new space in Ethan's understanding of what privilege had allowed him to ignore. When it was his turn to speak, Ethan hesitated. "I used to think I understood people," he said. "I thought I knew how to read them, how to assess who deserved my time. But I was reading a script I didn't even write, one I never questioned." He looked down for a moment, then met the group's eyes. "I didn't know how blind I was until I finally stood still long enough to see." There was no applause, no dramatic reaction, just a nod from Linda and a few quiet murmurs of appreciation. In this place, growth wasn't rewarded with fanfare. It was expected, not demanded, but encouraged. It was the baseline, not the goal. The final day of the program came faster than Ethan anticipated. He found himself dreading the goodbye. He had started helping Jaden build his go-kart in the center's workshop, even ordering parts out of his own pocket. They hadn't finished it, But the blueprint was alive now, stitched together with wires and ambition. On the morning of his departure, Jaden handed him a small folded piece of paper. "It's a wiring diagram," the boy said, "for when you visit again." Ethan smiled, his throat tight. "You want me to come back?" "Yeah," Jaden said, as if the answer should have been obvious. "You're part of the team now." Ethan placed the paper carefully in his coat pocket. He looked around the room one last time, the chipped paint, the hum of the AC, the laughter down the hall, and felt something settle inside him. A steadiness he hadn't known he was missing. Before he left, Linda met him at the door. "Most people come here expecting to teach something," she said. "They leave realizing they were the student all along." He nodded. "I was a slow learner. Better slow than never." He paused, then pulled out a sealed envelope from his jacket. "Can you give this to Amani?" Linda looked down at the handwriting and smiled softly. "I think she'll read it." Ethan stepped out into the cold, early dusk of Boston. The street felt louder now, more urgent. He passed by storefronts and commuters, each one living a life he would no longer assume he understood. For the first time, he walked without the need to be noticed. At home that night, he sat on his couch, the TV muted, the lights off. He took out Jaden's wiring diagram and studied it. There were smudges on the corners, and some labels were misspelled, but the blueprint was brilliant. Not just technically, but in its simplicity and courage. He realized that for years he had measured success by how little he let others in. He had equated control with excellence. But Jaden, Imani, Linda, they had shown him something else. That to truly see the world, you had to let it into you. Not just the parts you were comfortable with. All of it. You had to let it change you. And Ethan, for the first time in a long, long while, was ready to be changed. The first time Amani saw Ethan again, it wasn't by accident, it was by design. The Brooks Community Center had always been a space grounded in healing, but healing didn't mean avoidance. It meant accountability. Confrontation, when handled with care, could be redemptive. That was a principle her father had taught her long before the incident at Newport Prestige Motors. And while Dr. Isaiah Brooks had held his silence in the public arena, within the quiet of their home, he often spoke about the deeper work, the kind that happened after the spotlight moved on, when apology met sustained action. Imani hadn't replied to Ethan's letter right away. When Linda handed it to her, she read it once, then folded it neatly and placed it in the side pocket of her journal, saying nothing. She needed time, not to process what had been said, but to decide what she needed in return. The power had never truly been taken from her, but in the days that followed the dealership incident, she learned how to hold it differently, not as a shield, but as a lens. On the seventh day of the Empathy Immersion program, Ethan remained behind after the others had left. He stood outside the center's garden area, where volunteers had planted herbs and vegetables with the kids. He looked like he didn't quite know where to place himself anymore, as though the identity he had carried for so long had been shed but hadn't yet been replaced with something new. When Amani stepped into the courtyard, he turned instinctively. His face held none of the superiority she remembered. No arrogance, no performance. Just a quiet, vulnerable readiness. "Hi," he said. "Not Mr. Voss, not the manager, just Ethan." "Hi," she returned. For a moment, they stood in silence. It wasn't tense, just deliberate. The kind of quiet that asks, "Are you ready to speak honestly?" "I read your letter," Amani said finally. "All of it." He nodded, unsure whether he should speak next. She continued, "You wrote that you didn't see me that day, that you were wrong, and I believe you meant that, but I need you to know something. I wasn't invisible when I walked into that dealership. You looked at me. You studied me. You evaluated me. You saw me. You just decided I wasn't worthy." Ethan's eyes flickered, his jaw tightening slightly. Not out of defense, but out of shame. "I know," he said softly, "and I can't undo that. I wish I could. But what I can do, What I've started to do is rebuild the parts of me that let that decision feel justified in the first place. She looked at him carefully, measured, not because she doubted him, but because she had learned how to distinguish remorse from performance. This, to her surprise, didn't feel like performance. I've been volunteering here, he went on, not because I'm trying to prove something, but because it feels like the first place I've ever really listened. Amani folded her arms, her tone calm but resolute. I don't need you to be perfect, Ethan. But if you're going to change, it can't be a chapter. It has to be the rest of the book. Ethan let out a breath. I know. She let the weight of her words sit with him for a while. Then, unexpectedly, she smiled, just a little. You helped Jaden with the go-kart? He smiled back, a flicker of warmth breaking through. He's a tough engineer, doesn't take shortcuts. He gets that from his mentors, Amani said, the ones he trusts. It wasn't forgiveness, not in the traditional sense. It wasn't an erasure of what had happened, but it was something perhaps more sacred, recognition. The acknowledgement that someone could fall short of who they should have been and still rise towards something better. From that day forward, Ethan returned to the center weekly, not because he had to, but because it had become a place where he learned how to be whole. He cleaned floors, he mentored teens, he asked questions without pretending to already know the answers. He began speaking less and listening more, and when he returned to Newport Prestige Motors, he brought those lessons with him. Richard Mason was skeptical at first. He had expected Ethan to resign quietly or slide back into his former role with the same unshakable confidence. But the man who walked into his office a week later was changed, not just in demeanor, but in clarity. We need to rebuild, Ethan said plainly. Richard leaned back. From what? From everything, Ethan answered. From the systems we created that told us who deserved respect and who didn't. From the hiring practices that favor polish over perspective. From the assumption that wealth equals worth. Richard raised a brow. That's a bit dramatic. No, Ethan said. It's overdue. What followed was not easy. Ethan proposed a full restructuring of customer training, implicit bias education, community partnerships, and a mentorship program to bring underrepresented students into automotive design and sales roles. At first, the board resisted. Some employees rolled their eyes. But change has a way of taking root when it's persistent and patient. By the end of that quarter, Newport Prestige Motors wasn't just a dealership anymore. It was a statement. It opened its showroom to public school field trips. It hosted STEM workshops in partnership with the Brooks Foundation. And most importantly, it began treating curiosity as a credential, not a threat. One afternoon, months after that courtyard conversation, Imani received a formal invitation. Newport Prestige was launching its new youth mentorship initiative, and Ethan wanted her to be the keynote speaker. She stared at the envelope for a long time before opening it. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she took a walk, past the streets that once intimidated her, past the old bus stops she used to stand at when she dreamed of the future from the margins, past the places where she had once felt small. She didn't feel small anymore. When the day of the event arrived, Imani wore a slate gray jumpsuit and her favorite sneakers. She stood before an audience of students, engineers, and executives with her curls pulled back and her head high. She didn't speak about the day she was humiliated. She spoke about the day she chose to stay grounded in who she was, even when the room tried to tell her otherwise. She ended with a simple line. Sometimes the bridges we walk across are the same ones we're asked to build. Just make sure they're strong enough for others to follow. Ethan watched from the back of the room, no longer needing a spotlight. Just listening, learning, and letting the truth reshape him. After the event, they shared a quiet exchange. No speech, no grand gestures. Just a nod, a smile. and the mutual understanding that the bridge was still standing, stronger than before, anchored not in guilt, but in growth. In the months that followed, they remained connected, not through friendship in the conventional sense, but through a shared responsibility. They knew what it meant to stand on opposite sides of a fault line and still find a way to meet in the middle. Because real transformation doesn't always look like a clean break or a public reckoning. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's long. Sometimes it begins with the courage to say, I was wrong, and the courage to reply, then do right, consistently. And that was the bridge they built together. The night of the gala arrived with quiet elegance. Boston Civic Center was draped in warm lighting that spilled like gold over marble columns and velvet-lined corridors. Outside, the city shimmered in early winter, but inside, the room was alive with motion. Glasses clinked, violins hummed softly in the background, and voices rose in polite conversation. Guests in tailored suits and understated gowns floated between tables, unaware that this night was more than just a celebration. It was the culmination of something deeper, something invisible yet undeniable, a shift in legacy. At the center of it all stood Dr. Isaiah Brooks, not as a keynote speaker, not as a figurehead, but as a quiet architect behind so many changes no one in that room had seen coming. His foundation had grown, yes, but more than that, it had changed people. The gala marked the one-year anniversary of that pivotal moment, the one that started with a single act of dismissal and ended with a ripple that moved through lives, institutions, and minds. And now, those gathered here were not only donors or partners, they were witnesses. Among them, seated near the back with a calm composure, was Ethan Voss. He didn't wear the arrogance he once carried like armor. Tonight he wore a navy suit, modestly tailored, his shoulders more relaxed. There was no need to prove anything anymore. He had come to listen, to support, to acknowledge, in quiet dignity, that the man he had once been could no longer exist in the space he now inhabited. Across the room, Imani Brooks had just entered. She was radiant, not because of the soft, sea-glass dress she wore or the silver earrings that caught the light, but because of the stillness she carried. A composed confidence. She no longer moved through spaces seeking approval. She moved with direction, with intention. As she made her way through the crowd, heads turned, not because of spectacle, but because of story. Many of them knew who she was now, the girl from the video, the young woman who had turned injustice into momentum. But to Amani, those titles were never the point. What mattered was what she had built afterward. Girls Who Build, the organization she founded to empower girls of color in STEM, had launched only 8 months earlier. It had already provided over 100 scholarships, placed students in internships, and developed mentorships between professionals and high schoolers in underserved communities. What started as an idea in a composition notebook was now a movement, one born not of vengeance, but of vision. Ethan watched her approach the podium with a subtle swell of emotion rising in his chest, gratitude, humility, respect. It had taken him time and pain and effort, but he could now appreciate her not only as the girl he once wronged, but as the leader he had grown to admire. When Amani took the microphone, the room quieted with a natural reverence. I used to think legacy was something other people talked about, she began. That it belonged to those who built companies, invented technology, or made headlines. I didn't think a teenage girl with duct-tape sneakers and a hand-me-down backpack could leave a legacy. She paused, the memory flickering in her tone, but not overwhelming her. But I've learned that legacy doesn't begin with applause. It begins in silence. It begins in the moments when no one's watching, when you decide who you want to be in the face of who the world says you are. The audience leaned in. Last year I was told, without words, that I didn't belong in a place built for power and prestige. But tonight, I want to say this to every young girl, every person who's been overlooked. You don't have to be invited to walk in. Sometimes the door you're knocking on was built with bricks meant to keep you out. Walk in anyway. There was a stillness in the room, not out of shock, but of recognition. Imani didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Her presence did the work. And to those who have made mistakes, she continued, her eyes gently scanning the crowd, those who've had the courage to unlearn and rebuild, thank you. Change is not only possible, it's necessary, but it requires humility. And humility begins when we stop defending who we were and start working toward who we can become. She stepped back from the microphone to quiet applause, not thunderous, but meaningful. The kind of applause that didn't celebrate a performance, but honored a truth. After the speeches concluded, the evening flowed into conversations and shared memories. Donors discussed future programs. Students from the foundation beamed as they introduced mentors to their parents. And in the corner, by the tall windows overlooking the skyline, Ethan and Imani finally spoke again. It wasn't a grand reunion. It didn't need to be. Your speech, Ethan started, then paused. It reminded me why I came tonight. To listen? Imani asked, smiling softly. To witness, he replied, and to remember that redemption is never owned, it's rented, and the rent is due every day. Imani nodded, her smile deeper now. That's growth. They talked for a few minutes, not about the past, but about the kids at the center. About Jaden, who had just entered a robotics competition. About the dealership's new scholarship fund for aspiring engineers from low-income neighborhoods. About the small things that had grown into something much larger than either of them expected. As the evening drew to a close, Dr. Brooks took the stage for a brief, unscheduled word. I wasn't planning to speak tonight, he began, but I think this moment deserves something. He turned, briefly catching Imani's eye before continuing. This isn't just a fundraiser, it's a reckoning. Not in the punishing sense, but in the clarifying one. Tonight, we're not just here to celebrate what we've built. We're here to ask what kind of world we want to leave behind, not in headlines, but in hearts. He paused, letting the words sink in. My daughter taught me that legacy isn't a destination. It's a series of decisions. Decisions to speak when it's hard, to stand when it's uncomfortable, to forgive when it's earned. And to lead, not because the spotlight is on you, but because the shadows behind you need your light. The crowd rose in applause, not out of obligation, but out of something far more powerful, shared conviction. That night, as guests departed and the city lights reflected off the sidewalks, something lingered in the air, a shift, not just in one dealership, not just in one foundation, but in the hearts of those who had witnessed what it meant to turn a wound into a seed, and to let that seed bloom into justice, compassion, and transformation. Later that week, Ethan returned to Newport Prestige Motors, walking through the showroom with a renewed sense of purpose. The cars were still there, the luxury, the shine, the polish, but something had changed in the culture. Customers were no longer sized up by appearance. They were welcomed, asked questions, listened to. The new staff came from schools no one at the dealership had considered before. The showroom had become more than a sales floor. It was now a place of connection. In the far corner of his desk, Ethan kept a photograph of the go-kart Jaden had completed. It sat next to a small, framed quote written in marker on printer paper, a gift from the boy himself. You don't fix what you don't understand. That became Ethan's mantra, not just for cars, for people, for systems, for himself. And across the city, in a modest office within the Brooks Foundation, Imani hung a map on the wall, a map covered in pins marking the cities where Girls Who Build would expand. She added a new pin that day, not because of funding, because a school district in rural Illinois had called her after watching her gala speech. They wanted to start a chapter for their girls, for their future. Amani smiled, placed the pen, and whispered quietly to herself, "We're just getting started." And in that quiet, expansive moment, the legacy they never saw coming, one born from harm, healed through humility, and built through action, stood tall, unshakable, and full of light. The power of dignity, a story worth remembering. When we look back on the story of Amani Brooks, we are not merely retracing the journey of a young black girl who faced prejudice inside the glass walls of a luxury car dealership. We are witnessing something far more profound, a transformation that reached far beyond a showroom floor, reverberating through lives, institutions, and deeply entrenched beliefs. This is not just a story about discrimination, it is a story about awakening, about the resilience of one girl who chose dignity over rage, clarity over chaos, and purpose over pride. Imani's story began with a simple moment, a moment that so many people of color, particularly black girls and women, know too well. The sting of being dismissed before even being heard. She stepped into Newport Prestige Motors, not to provoke, not to perform, but to honor a memory, to touch a dream her late mother once shared with her. But what greeted her was not admiration or respect. It was skepticism, ridicule, the kind of subtle cruelty that masquerades as professionalism but cuts just as deeply as overt hatred. Yet she didn't retaliate with outrage. She didn't raise her voice or challenge the system with force. She simply left, holding her head high, absorbing the humiliation in silence, a silence that, as fate would have it, would soon speak louder than any words. That silence reached the ears of Dr. Isaiah Brooks, her father. A brilliant mind, a composed leader, and a man who understood that true power is not demonstrated in the capacity to destroy, but in the willingness to teach. When he returned to the dealership the next morning in a gleaming Rolls-Royce, it wasn't to flex his wealth, it was to deliver a lesson, one that would ultimately shape not only the future of Ethan Voss, the man who had dismissed his daughter, but the culture of the dealership, and beyond that, the community at large. But it wasn't Isaiah's presence that changed Ethan, it was what came afterward. What transformed Ethan wasn't public humiliation or career damage, it was immersion. The Empathy Immersion program at the Brooks Community Center stripped away everything he thought made him superior. The crisp suits, the rehearsed greetings, the curated exclusivity, all of that crumbled in the face of real lives. Children who dreamed with open hearts, volunteers who served without seeking recognition, and a culture rooted not in profit, but in presence. There, Ethan met Jaden, a young boy with wild imagination and the kind of raw intelligence that you don't learn from textbooks. Jaden didn't care about titles. He didn't care about prestige. He saw Ethan not for who he was, but for who he could be. And through Jaden's innocent honesty and open heart, Ethan began to realize the true nature of worth. He realized that the worst kind of blindness is the one we choose. When we decide that certain people simply don't belong in certain spaces based on how they look, speak, or carry themselves. That it's easy to dismiss someone when we've been taught, consciously or unconsciously, to associate power with polish, intellect with Ivy League, and respect with status. But Amani's quiet strength disrupted that illusion, and through her, Ethan began to see, not just her, but himself. Amani, for her part, never sought revenge. What she sought was growth, and more importantly, she demanded that growth come not in the form of empty apologies, but in sustained, visible change. Her ability to draw a boundary, not of exclusion but of expectation, was what ultimately opened the path for Ethan to rebuild and for the dealership to be reborn. She went on to found Girls Who Build, an organization that is now empowering hundreds of young girls across the country to step boldly into fields where they've been historically excluded. She used the pain of one encounter not as a reason to pull away, but as a reason to build forward. And in doing so, she became not a victim of circumstance, but a leader of change. This entire story, from dismissal to dignity, from harm to healing, teaches us something essential about the world we live in today. We live in a world where assumptions are made in milliseconds, where people are often judged by their zip code, their skin color, their clothes, or the way they speak. A world where status is prioritized over substance, and where the value of a person is often assessed before their story is even known. But Imani's story shows us that it doesn't have to stay that way. It reminds us that one moment, one quiet refusal to be diminished, can start a revolution. That redemption isn't a grand gesture, but a daily choice. That the most important legacies are not written in headlines or stamped in luxury. They are etched in how we treat others when we think no one is watching. And it reminds us that even the people who fail us, the ones who look down on us, can change. But only if they are willing to do the work, to unlearn, and to listen, truly listen. So, what do we take away from this? We take away the truth that power rooted in compassion is far more enduring than power rooted in fear or superiority. That leadership begins the moment we choose empathy over ego, that we must teach our children not just to aim high, but to look around, lift others, and listen deeply. We learn that it's not enough to not be racist. We must be actively anti-discriminatory in our workplaces, in our classrooms, in our customer service counters, in our boardrooms, and in our hearts. We are reminded that it's not weakness to admit when we're wrong. In fact, it's the most courageous thing we can do. Ethan's redemption came not from wealth or influence, but from the humility to sit beside a 10-year-old boy and ask, "Teach me." And finally, we learn that our silence matters, because sometimes the most powerful stand we can take is to not leave quietly, to stay, to speak, to build. So what can you do? If you've ever been like Amani, overlooked, underestimated, silenced, know that your voice matters. You are not alone, and your presence is not only valid, it is vital. Keep walking into rooms where people say you don't belong. Take up space, speak up, and build something that makes it impossible for the next person to be ignored the way you were. If you've ever been like Ethan, quick to judge, slow to listen, know that change is possible. But it begins with humility. Ask yourself where your biases live. Examine your blind spots. And don't wait until you're exposed to change. Choose to change because it's right. And if you're someone who sees this story from the outside, don't stay neutral. Use your voice to amplify the right conversations. Support organizations like Girls Who Build, volunteer, mentor. Speak out when you see someone being disrespected. Not because it's performative, but because it's necessary. Let this story be a mirror. Let it be a map. Let it move you. And if it did move you, if you found yourself inspired, challenged, or even unsettled, then help us continue sharing stories like this. Stories that remind us of the humanity in each of us, the dignity we all deserve, and the world we can build when we decide that silence is no longer an option. Please subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. Your support helps us continue creating powerful, meaningful content that speaks truth, builds empathy, and creates change. Click the subscribe button, leave a comment sharing what this story meant to you, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Let's build a community where stories like Imani's aren't rare. They're recognized, respected, and repeated. Thank you for being part of this journey. We'll see you in the next story. And until then, keep showing up with courage, with clarity, and with compassion. When we look back on the story of Imani Brooks, we are not merely retracing the journey of a young black girl who faced prejudice inside the glass walls of a luxury car dealership. We are witnessing something far more profound, a transformation that reached far beyond a showroom floor, reverberating through lives, institutions, and deeply entrenched beliefs. This is not just a story about discrimination. It is a story about awakening, about the resilience of one girl who chose dignity over rage, clarity over chaos, and purpose over pride. Imani's story began with a simple moment, a moment that so many people of color, particularly black girls and women, know too well: the sting of being dismissed before even being heard. She stepped into Newport Prestige Motors, not to provoke, not to perform, but to honor a memory, to touch a dream her late mother once shared with her. But what greeted her was not admiration or respect. It was skepticism, ridicule, the kind of subtle cruelty that masquerades as professionalism, but cuts just as deeply as overt hatred. Yet, she didn't retaliate with outrage. She didn't raise her voice or challenge the system with force. She simply left, holding her head high, absorbing the humiliation in silence, a silence that, as fate would have it, would soon speak louder than any words. That silence reached the ears of Dr. Isaiah Brooks, her father, a brilliant mind, a composed leader, and a man who understood that true power is not demonstrated in the capacity to destroy, but in the willingness to teach. When he returned to the dealership the next morning in a gleaming Rolls-Royce, it wasn't to flex his wealth. It was to deliver a lesson, one that would ultimately shape not only the future of Ethan Voss, the man who had dismissed his daughter, but the culture of the dealership, and beyond that, the community at large. But it wasn't Isaiah's presence that changed Ethan. It was what came afterward. What transformed Ethan wasn't public humiliation or career damage. It was immersion. The Empathy Immersion program at the Brooks Community Center stripped away everything he thought made him superior: the crisp suits, the rehearsed greetings, the curated exclusivity. All of that crumbled in the face of real lives. Children who dreamed with open hearts, volunteers who served without seeking recognition, and a culture rooted not in profit, but in presence. There, Ethan met Jaden, a young boy with wild imagination and the kind of raw intelligence that you don't learn from textbooks. Jaden didn't care about titles. He didn't care about prestige. He saw Ethan not for who he was, but for who he could be. And through Jaden's innocent honesty and open heart, Ethan began to realize the true nature of worth. He realized that the worst kind of blindness is the one we choose, when we decide that certain people simply don't belong in certain spaces based on how they look, speak, or carry themselves. That it's easy to dismiss someone when we've been taught, consciously or unconsciously, to associate power with polish, intellect with Ivy League, and respect with status. But Amani's quiet strength disrupted that illusion, and through her, Ethan began to see, not just her, but himself. Amani, for her part, never sought revenge. What she sought was growth. And more importantly, she demanded that growth come not in the form of empty apologies, but in sustained, visible change. Her ability to draw a boundary, not of exclusion, but of expectation, was what ultimately opened the path for Ethan to rebuild, and for the dealership to be reborn. She went on to found Girls Who Build, an organization that is now empowering hundreds of young girls across the country to step boldly into fields where they've been historically excluded. She used the pain of one encounter not as a reason to pull away, but as a reason to build forward. And in doing so, she became not a victim of circumstance, but a leader of change. This entire story, from dismissal to dignity, from harm to healing, teaches us something essential about the world we live in today. We live in a world where assumptions are made in milliseconds, where people are often judged by their zip code, their skin color, their clothes, or the way they speak. A world where status is prioritized over substance, and where the value of a person is often assessed before their story is even known. But Amani's story shows us that it doesn't have to stay that way. It reminds us that one moment, one quiet refusal to be diminished, can start a revolution. That redemption isn't a grand gesture, but a daily choice. That the most important legacies are not written in headlines or stamped in luxury. They are etched in how we treat others when we think no one is watching. And it reminds us that even the people who fail us, the ones who look down on us, can change. But only if they are willing to do the work, to unlearn, and to listen, truly listen. So, what do we take away from this? We take away the truth that power rooted in compassion is far more enduring than power rooted in fear or superiority. That leadership begins the moment we choose empathy over ego, that we must teach our children not just to aim high, but to look around, lift others, and listen deeply. We learn that it's not enough to not be racist. We must be actively anti-discriminatory in our workplaces, in our classrooms, in our customer service counters, in our boardrooms, and in our hearts. We are reminded that it's not weakness to admit when we're wrong. In fact, it's the most courageous thing we can do. Ethan's redemption came not from wealth or influence, but from the humility to sit beside a 10-year-old boy and ask, "Teach me." And finally, we learn that our silence matters, because sometimes the most powerful stand we can take is to not leave quietly, to stay, to speak, to build. So what can you do? If you've ever been like Amani, overlooked, underestimated, silenced, know that your voice matters. You are not alone. And your presence is not only valid, it is vital. Keep walking into rooms where people say you don't belong. Take up space, speak up, and build something that makes it impossible for the next person to be ignored the way you were. If you've ever been like Ethan, quick to judge, slow to listen, know that change is possible. But it begins with humility. Ask yourself where your biases live. Examine your blind spots. And don't wait until you're exposed to change. Choose to change because it's right. And if you're someone who sees this story from the outside, don't stay neutral. Use your voice to amplify the right conversations. Support organizations like Girls Who Build. Volunteer, mentor. Speak out when you see someone being disrespected, not because it's performative, but because it's necessary. Let this story be a mirror. Let it be a map. Let it move you. And if it did move you, if you found yourself inspired, challenged, or even unsettled, then help us continue sharing stories like this. Stories that remind us of the humanity in each of us, the dignity we all deserve, and the world we can build when we decide that silence is no longer an option. Please subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. Your support helps us continue creating powerful, meaningful content that speaks truth, builds empathy, and creates change. Click the subscribe button, leave a comment sharing what this story meant to you, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Let's build a community where stories like Amani's aren't rare. They're recognized, respected, and repeated. Thank you for being part of this journey. We'll see you in the next story. And until then, keep showing up with courage, with clarity, and with compassion.